Today on Locked On Canadiens, how much faith should we have in Kent Hughes and his process?
You're Locked On Canadiens, your daily podcast on the Montreal Canadiens, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hi there, everyone, and welcome to episode 1072. And today we're going to talk about so much stuff, including should we trust the process? As you know, we're free and available wherever you get your podcasts, as well as on YouTube. And today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. My name is Laura Sab, also known as The Active Stick, and I'm joined, as always, by the wonderful Scott Matla of Habs Eyes on the Prize. Scott, how are you doing on this muggy here, warm and muggy Sunday morning?
I mean, I'm great. It's the last Premier League morning until the end of summer here. So I'm actually ramping up to watch the final matches of the season here with 1, 2, 3. I have 4 screens that I can make use of with this. So I am very excited to just settle in on Sunday and watch that, and also tackle a mountain of laundry that I have left, because I am that kind of person, unfortunately.
And that's exactly us too. Here in Canada, it is a Victoria Day weekend. So those of you listening to this from your commutes back from your chalets or your cottages or cabins or whatever you call it across the country, we have been in the midst of the NHL playoffs. And honestly, Scott wanted to talk about lessons to be learned from the NHL playoffs, whereas I just want to be like, bye, Bruins.
Well, that's the thing is that it's like, oh yeah, the Bruins lost. Finally, they did the one thing we wanted to, embarrass Toronto. And then the other side of that is, oh, well, the Panthers advanced and we hate them in a different way. It's a different hate that I dislike them for a lot of things, but I think my hatred for the Bruins overrules all of this, and my hatred for the Leafs overrules all of that. So it's just like a Russian nesting doll of hating things, all the way down to, like, I would guess Detroit at the bottom is like the smallest amount of potential hate with that.
So same here, I would say. So Scott, what do we want to say about, like, what do we want the Habs to learn from the current NHL playoff developings and exits and unexpected either upsets or surprises?
I guess the biggest thing is here, and this we're going to actually shift out west for this, because the biggest lesson I think I have learned, or that should be taken from these playoffs, is smart drafting and development can go a really, really long way for teams. I look at what the Dallas Stars have done in that Wyatt Johnson was not a top 10 pick. A guy like Jason Robertson was picked later in the draft. Jake Ottinger was picked a little bit later on. Jamie Benn was a later round pick, and I know that he is a lot older than these other players, but developing players and trusting your own drafting philosophy can go a long way. Miro Heiskanen there were some people, it's like, is he good? Is he not? Which way is he going on this? I look at all the pieces that Dallas has put together in this. Logan Stankoven continues to be incredible. That I know Habs fans wanted him, but the biggest thing I've learned is Dallas drafts these players because they believe in a certain type of player, one that they draft the best guy in front of them. And then they develop them very properly. Their team in Texas, the Texas Stars in the AHL, always does very well. Wyatt Johnson spent time there. Logan Stankoven spent time there. Maverick Bourque spent time there. And including some of these guys like Rope Hintz, et cetera, that they found outside that usual star round. And Colorado is a very good team. Dallas's depth and ability to utilize all of these players is that, oh, well, cool. Tyler Seguin and Jamie Benn are off the ice, and here comes Wyatt Johnson. Oh, here comes Jason Robertson. Here comes Logan Stankoven. Is hard to compete with, especially a Colorado team that has injuries, has some missing pieces, and lost one of their players to suspension as well. They are the lesson. Even if they do not win the cup, I think a lot of teams should be looking at what Dallas has done, and we need to start realizing it's a lot like what Tampa used to do, is they drafted and developed very smart, that if they don't win this year, they can run it back next year with this young talent in there and potentially get better.
Right. And I think that's the biggest thing here is that, they didn't have high picks in order to pick those. And a lot of times people think, all right, you know what, you don't get a top 10, you don't get a top 5, you don't get a top 3, it's over. Or you mess up a pick, right? Like the Canadiens have had a couple top 3 picks where, they haven't necessarily picked the right player. And whereas with Dallas, the lesson is you just find that value. You find the most value you're going to get at that spot, and then you work really hard on that development. And I think that's something the Canadiens have been, putting more emphasis on, is that development piece. It's not just the drafting. They get lucky, right? Well, they get lucky. They were bad, so they drafted high. But the development piece is so, so important. And I think the biggest thing about the Dallas Stars is that they've done all of this under the radar, right? Only a couple of years ago, people were like, I don't believe in them. It's a paper tiger. I don't know, because they didn't have those big names. They didn't have those people that you're talking about. And then you look at those players right now, and they are really the backbone of a team that everyone feels like they can root for. And most people would rather see them win than pretty much any other team that's left in the playoffs, or that has been left in the playoffs. And I feel confident in the fact that they're going to be able to make as much noise as possible. I don't want to pick a Stanley Cup winner at this point.
I just to put a cap on this, I go all the way back to 2013, and in there, Nick Paul, well, not with the team, very good player for, I believe he's off in Ottawa now. You have Jason Dickinson, who played a long time in the NHL here. I believe he was 443 games. Then you had Valeri Nichushkin, obviously got traded to Colorado. You move up Julius Honka, but then the next year you have Dennis Gurianov and Rope Hintz, who was picked in the middle of the second round. Beyond that, Miro Heiskanen at third overall. You have Jake Ottinger at the end of the first round. You have Jason Robertson. You have going the next year, Ty Dellandrea, who is now playing like a fourth end role. Thomas Harley. They've gone and they found these pieces. And at the opposite end of things is this is a thing for both the East and the West. Is I worry about teams that rely too much on one line or one set of players to get things done. Boston was leaning heavily on their goalies because they don't have a top line center since Patrice Bergeron retired. And not saying that they don't have someone playing in that role, but they don't have someone who plays it the same way. You have
and who
Edmonton
can complement their big players.
Yeah, like Jeremy Swayman is a very good goaltender. He gives the Bruins every chance to win in this series. And admittedly, he is the only reason why this game potentially that series went that long as it is. And then you have like Edmonton, where it is McDavid and Draisaitl, and it just feels like the rest of the team is, if they're off, you're relying on a superstar to save yourself. And in Toronto, I know we've hit this ad nauseum, but that team is built around its core four. And when usually only one of the four shows up in the playoffs, and that's William Nylander, you have a problem that I worry about making a team too top heavy. Like the Canadiens have a very good top line. That is kind of it at this point from this past season. I don't want them to make the playoffs solely just because their one line is all they have. Because if that gets shut down, who is stepping up in this group here? That is kind of what I worry about a little bit. It is great to have a top line and players that are so dominant, but you need to find that balance. And Boston kind of didn't have that. Even Tampa a little bit this year didn't really have that. Toronto, Edmonton's up in the air whether they beat Vancouver or not on Monday night. But even if they don't, they got taken to 7 games by an AHL goaltender this year, which is probably not what you want, because in the next round you have Dallas, who is potentially the deepest team in the Western Conference.
And I think like that's also a big thing, is what I wanted to say, is that in the playoffs, there's so much scouting going on. It's such a short sample size. You have 7 games, right? You don't even a lot of times get to that 7-game series. So if you have only one line, then the opponents will have prepared every which way to shut down that line, right? Like, and that was a common complaint, with Montreal, be like, oh, you know what? Thomas Buchanan is quiet in the playoffs. No, he's not quiet in the playoffs. He's always wearing the defenseman of the opposite, of the opposing team, or like the the shutdown line or whatever. Like everywhere he skates, they're on his back. So, things like that where like, we expect Nick Suzuki, Cole Caulfield, and then Uri Slafkovsky to be wearing the opponents. We want there to be, let's say a Kirby Doc, let's say, other people who can step up. And then also when you have those other people who can step up, you can also interchange. You don't necessarily always have to play Uri Slafkovsky with Nick Suzuki in the playoffs, right? You can double shift certain people, you can switch things around just to counter that defense. But if you don't have that depth, it's not going to happen. So I'm really glad you brought it up, Scott. And, at the end of the day, like, I'm just happy to see the Bruins go. And in the meantime, there are some, it's not a coaching carousel as much as it's coaching retreads. So let's get into that in our next segment. But first, how often do you worry about providing for your family in case anything ever happens to you? You know you need a life insurance policy, and sometimes, your work might provide one, but you don't know how well that coverage is going to go. How do you go about looking for what you need? Let me tell you about Policy Genius, because they have very well-trained agents and they compare the top options from the top companies. They have licensed experts and they're going to guide you through it. They're going to talk you through the process step by step. They're going to talk you through what you might potentially find. And with Policy Genius, you can find life insurance policies that can start at just $292 per year for $1 million worth of coverage. Some options even offer same-day approval, and they avoid unnecessary medical exams. The advice is always unbiased, and there's so many 5-star reviews that'll tell you, you're doing the right thing. So check life insurance off your to-do list in no time with Policy Genius. Head to policygenius.com/lockedonnhl or click the link in the description to get your free life insurance quotes to see how much you could save. That's policygenius.com/lockedonnhl. All right, we haven't had a chance to talk about this yet because our last episode was a draft mailbag with Hattie Kalikesh. So if you have missed that, go back and check it out. We talked about so many players that could be available where the Habs are picking, including Demidov, even though, it's a long shot, but take a listen. It was a fun episode. It's the Friday episode. In the meantime, some big news in our division. The Toronto Maple Leafs have chosen their head coach for their next round of first-round playoff upsets.
Yeah, well, here's the thing is in that I usually like to make fun of Toronto for a lot of things. Somehow the guy they've hired Craig Berube on a 4-year deal, seemingly makes a lot of sense in that he's the one who brought the Blues from worst in the NHL to literal Stanley Cup champions in one season, and that eventually things kind of just slowed down and ran their course. And I'm trying to find the tweet from Corey Schneider, Shutdown Line on Twitter, that he was talking a lot about how Craig Berube as a coach has altered what the Blues started doing. They were a lot more east and west and not north and south, making goaltenders move and all these things here. And for Berube, I think it is a coach that is going to turn this team around into, hey, they need someone a little bit hard-nosed on this, that they need someone to, I don't want to say, baby the team here. I don't think Sheldon Keefe had that same manner of like getting a team going here. Again, he took a team that was last in the NHL. The Blues were atrocious and made them Stanley Cup champions with a young core, some veterans in there, turned around some players who seemed to be in like steep decline. And then eventually, because the goaltending got bad, thank you, Jordan Binnington, the wheels fell off. And he's coming in with a young goaltender, Joseph Woll, who's likely going to be a starter. And I think that this is a smart hire for this team for what they need. However, we're going to see if the way that he implements his play style will fit the Leafs. A guy like Nylander and Matthews, I think, will be fine, but is Mitch Marner going to fit this system? Does Toronto have the defensive core for this team here to fit that system here? Because I want to take a look at the roster that they had in St. Louis there, 18-19. So let's see on here. Ryan O'Reilly was on the team. Vladimir Tarasenko, Braden Shen, David Perron, Alex Pietrangelo, They don't have an Alex Pietrangelo in Toronto. Tyler Bozak, Jaden Schwartz, Vince Dunn. They don't really have a Vince Dunn in Toronto. Robert Thomas, a very young Robert Thomas. There's some older guys in there. Joel Edmondson, who was just 25 at the time. And then they had two goaltenders in Jake Allen and Jordan Binnington. I don't know if they have that same level of group there. They have very good players in Toronto, but it is something that I think that Berube might be the guy who actually gets them actually well and truly over that first round hump, assuming that they can fill out this team a little bit further. I think that they have the opportunity to do so. But boy, it's going to be a real interesting offseason in Toronto because they need help in a lot of ways. Namely, they need defensemen to fit this system. They need those guys in front of the net who are going to be mean, who are going to be nasty, but can also play the other way. Alex Pietrangelo and Vince Dunn were those guys in St. Louis. I don't think Morgan Riley's that guy. I don't know if Timothy Liljegren's that guy. I know that Ilya Lyubushkin and current Joel Edmondson are not those guys. And it's going to be interesting. It's a completely different coach than what Toronto's had in the past. They've tried the old school guy, and Mike Babcock couldn't get him anywhere. And now it's a slightly newer old school guy. But if this doesn't work out and Toronto, again, can't get it done, you start looking further up the chart on that. But that's a story for another day on that.
So here's my thing, is that you mentioned they need defensemen to fit the system. I think that's been a blind spot and a weakness for them for a really long time. I think at the end of the day, the lack of completeness on this team, and I feel like a coach like Craig Berube would be able to bring it forward if they had halfway decent goaltending, halfway decent defense, and maybe one less superstar up front, right? I feel like he's got a lot more ability for an ensemble kind of coaching or ensemble kind of strategy. Whereas I think with Toronto, at this point, you mentioned before, even privately, you said ironically, this is the best fit for them. I think even though it is the best fit for them, I still don't think that they have the pieces they need. The problem is they lack the pieces. It's not even, I know there's all kinds of hand-wringing about this player gets paid too much to be silent in the playoffs, this player, blah, 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 all of that kind of stuff. And which is legitimate, the thing is, though, when you have that kind of player, every other opponent in the NHL is just trying to shut them down. They're just trying to neutralize them. That doesn't mean the player it themselves is underperforming as much as it means this is the playoffs. You have to get serious, and everybody is game planning against you. And they've been game planning against you since day one. You're a team that's a sure shot to make the playoffs, and everyone looks at they look at Austin Matthews, they look at Mitch Marner, they look at William Nylander, and they go, which one of these guys can we shut down? And all you need to do is make sure that you break up that chemistry between those players. And at the end of the day, you end up with oh, this guy's underperforming. They got the opponents, obviously, they didn't have to deal with Nylander for most of the games because he had migraines. But with the Mitch Martin, everybody's oh, he's quiet. At the same time, you know what I mean? What are the Leafs doing to counter the fact that everyone is zoned in on two guys on your team?
And here's the thing too, is that they're not the only team bringing back old faces or adding coaches. Rod Brindamore signed a 5-year extension with Carolina, which we really should talk with Corey Schneider or someone about what is up in Carolina, because I can't wrap my head around why a team that is seemingly built so well just can't get over the hump. The Sabres brought back Lindy Ruff, which I don't know. Maybe the nostalgia pop works for a season and everything writes its course with everyone not being injured or whatever, but I don't get that, and that actually bodes well for the Canadiens. Travis Green in Ottawa I don't think he's the guy. I really, truly don't think he's the guy for that team, but not my problem. And the before we kind of transition out of this into the last segment is I want to know what Winnipeg's going to do, because they apparently had a call with Berube. They've interviewed Todd McClellan. They've interviewed Sheldon Keefe, I believe. But apparently they also have interest in promoting Scott Arniel, who is one of their assistants who took over when Rick Bowness was out with personal health issues and everything. And all I can think is, why would you let Bowness go, a guy who clearly, was a step behind where this team needed to be this year, especially in the playoffs? and hire an assistant coach who thinks the same way. You have, with bonus there are rumors about Cole Perfetti doesn't fit into this lineup. He's not playing enough. You have Nikolai Ehlers that he just doesn't like for whatever reason, who might be a trade candidate, and we will talk about that this offseason. I want to see what the Jets are going to do, because if they go old school, if I'm Kent Hughes, I am calling them up and offering them their first-round pick back and getting Nikolai Ehlers in return. And then you have a second line that is Newhook, Doc, and Ehlers, and you just go with it at that point. It's just as good as potential, maybe because he's a little bit older, but maybe not a Trevor Zegras level thing, but something I think the Canadiens would benefit from. It's just watching the coaching carousel and not worrying about it, because Martin St. Louis is somehow the 5th longest tenured coach in the NHL right now, just blows my mind across the board there. It is nice to not be worrying about it.
Speaking of not being worried about things, do we trust Kent Hughes and the draft process for this upcoming draft? We're going to talk about that in just one moment here on Locked On Canadiens. But first, this episode is brought to you by eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. The formula for winning championships is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and to level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED lights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time, or you get your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it is easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only, exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. All right, so let's talk about Kent Hughes and let's talk about the draft process, because interestingly, one of the things I did want to talk about is whether or not they should trade that pick, because people keep asking about trading it, and then we have other listeners that are angry at the people who keep talking about trading that pick. So let's just talk about the overall process. Like, what do we think? Do we think the Montreal Canadiens are going to galaxy brain this draft?
It's so it's hard, because here's the thing. When we thought they've galaxy brained the draft in the past, looking at, the Slafkovsky draft and the Reinbacher draft pick, in the end, and this is obviously a very small sample size in the grand scheme of things, Juraj Slafkovsky seems to have been the right choice, and he's turning out well. And the rest of that draft class, Beck and Hudson, jury's out on Machar, but like Angstrom and stuff like that, have turned out very well. That Kent Hughes and his staff have done a good job putting things together. Reinbacher, it's up in the air. Who really knows 100% on the side of that? But it seems like he was the right option there. I just want to take a look at the rest of that draft class real quick. But I don't know if I can call it galaxy braining, just because it's like, well, this might have just turned out all right anyways, and we need to trust in what Kent Hughes is doing. And maybe, 2023 wasn't my favorite draft class overall, but right now you have Reinbacher, you have Jacob Fowler, who's one of the best goalies prospects in the world. Florian Xhekaj seems to have taken a big step forward here. Philip Eriksson seems to be a really smart pick in the later rounds there. And this year, like we've talked about, like you and I have a love for wanting Caden Lindstrom or TJ Ginla. That's on our wish list of things. But if they go for Beckett Sennecke, I'm looking at this and going, I don't love the idea of this. But also in the last couple years, I don't think Kent Hughes has really steered me wrong in this regard, in that I get it. I understand why they like this player and why they think they can work with someone with their development staff. Like we talked about in the first segment, drafting and developing is just as important as picking a player there. You can pick the best player available, but if you don't give them the tools to develop, it doesn't matter. I'm cautiously optimistic in this because there's so many options. The only thing that I might question is if they go defense, but at the same time, maybe Kent Hughes knows what he's doing on this. I know we are over a month out from the draft. The draft combine's in a couple of weeks as well. I can't not give Hughes some of the benefit of the doubt so far, in that maybe not, they haven't hit every note that I would have hoped for, but as time goes on, I watch these players take those steps forward and understand, hey, they bet on this prospect taking that step and believing and giving them the tools to make that next step forward here. And if they go with Beckett Sennecke, okay, I don't have to love that considering I had other things there, but I can trust that you have a plan in place to get the most out of this player now. And I'm really hoping that's the case. If they pick him at 5th overall, okay, usually when they have another first round pick, they swing for a high upside player. And I'm okay with that, assuming they do that if they don't trade it for somebody else in there.
Right. And I think, the longer time goes on, because I remember the first time we talked about TJ Ginla, he was much lower on the I guess the scouting lists, the rankings, I should say. And as we've gotten closer to it now, a lot of people are slotting him in for that 5th overall pick. Whereas the rumblings are that the Habs are interested in Sennecke instead. And usually in the last 2 years, the rumblings have been correct. I don't know who has their sources where, but the rumblings seem to point a lot of the times, like they get it right? Like, and so for me, like, we need to be prepared for the Canadiens picking Sennecke, unless they have another player they have their eye on who they don't believe will be available at 5th. I think that's the biggest thing. For me, I don't know. If you're going to be picking him, you can afford to draft down and get something or get rid of a contract, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm not necessarily against the idea of drafting Sennecke. But I do think that if there are other options in play, the Canadiens should be weighing them. Like, I don't think that they should do that thing that GMs sometimes do, or front offices sometimes do, where they fall in love with a player and then, like, that's their guy. And up until the draft, like, all they do is they talk themselves into picking that guy, as opposed to weighing all of the other options. And a lot of teams do this. And a lot of teams, like, internally, their rankings are different than public scouting, because public scouting take a lot of other things into play, whereas teams really do look at what their own needs are. And that's why a lot of times you get people picking just like some large guy because he's large, right? Things like that. So I honestly, like, I'm not going to be disappointed, because as Scott said, the Canadiens really have a lot of faith in their ability to develop. And that is different than what we've seen in the past. I think in the past, the development piece wasn't working out. Whereas now I have a lot more confidence that the Canadiens are going to put the right coaches, the right specialists, the right everything, the right skills coach. I mean, they already have him. All of that kind of stuff. They're going to do everything it takes to get the best out of that player. I just personally, like, that's a player that most of the scouts that we have spoken to, both publicly and in private, think that it's like, it's a little high for him to go.
Yeah, and here's the thing is that I trust they have a plan in place for this, is that 5th might have been too high for David Reinbacher, but we saw that immediately after that in the last draft, Dmitry Shemishev went, which is, it makes me think of the Kotkaniemi draft year again, which Andy at RallyCap, or used to be at RallyCap on Twitter, asked for our reaction to Kotkaniemi potentially being bought out, and we will talk about that this week. Is that the Canadiens saw there was going to be a run on these things, and a player that they valued and wanted wouldn't be available if they traded. So they made the pick. Yeah, they put their head on out there. They stuck their neck out a little bit, but if it works out, that's kind of all right. That's perfectly fine. And I'm wondering if they don't just if they play it, if they take the upside swing at 5 or 27 there. Like, I've seen mock drafts for Cole Hudson, who's the NTDP's leading points by defenseman. Like, I'm not opposed to these things. I really just kind of want to know which way it's going to go. And until we get, the Bob McKenzie rankings and stuff like that, I don't think we're going to have a full picture here. And there's so many options. It's almost impossible for Hughes to make the wrong choice at 5th. Even if he picks Sennecke, okay, I trust that there was some kind of plan in place with this, or they might trade down a few spots for him and collect things. I am willing at this point to trust them, with not like blindly. I don't want to blindly trust everything a management team does. that's not healthy. But I look at this and I go, I am more willing to trust your viewpoint and your thought process behind this, because you've proven it right with a guy like Juraj Slafkovsky and the development you've put in place for a lot of these players here, that if you pick Beckett Sennecke, you have a plan in place to get him to where you need him. And I hate to use the term unicorn because it's kind of become a meme in this fan base, but make that unicorn pick out of it.
Unicorn pick, Galaxy Brain. We're going all the way into fantasy world now. In the meantime, as Scott said, people wanted us to talk about Kotkaniemi. We had a lot of Trevor Zegras questions in the mailbag that we haven't gotten to, and some more mailbag stuff. So all of that is going to come up later this week. So please make sure you are subscribed to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts, as well as on YouTube. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where you get your team every single day. You can find us on Twitter at LO_Canadiens. You can email us at lockedoncanadiens@gmail.com. You can find Scott all over social media at Scott Matlow. You'll find me at The Active Stick. We want to thank everyone so much for listening, and we will see you all next time.